clock, chaps, so off we go.
Yeah, I think so. I'm sorry. Bill, do you want to put some water by your chair, or is it all right here? Yeah.
An hour of discussion, then half an hour of audience questions. Is that right, Jonathan?
Just tap the top.
It's not working. Good evening.
Yep.
Oh. Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. My name is Roderick Mulligan. I am the chairman of the Free Speech Union. It falls to me to make some remarks to get the evening going. Thank you all for turning out. It is very gratifying to see this level of support. It's not me you've come to hear, so I wish to introduce our two guests. On my right, ladies and gentlemen, Lord Sumption, an outstanding figure in Britain in the areas of law, history and academia. He originally qualified as a barrister. He was admitted straight from the bar to the Supreme Court. He was a Queen's Counsel at the age of 38. He is described as one of the most decorated legal professionals of his generation, described by the Guardian newspaper and many other people as the brain of Britain. He is the author of the definitive 5-volume work on the 100 Years' War. If there is anything about the 100 Years' War you ever wanted cleared up, tonight is your opportunity. And with him, ladies and gentlemen, as you know, Sir Bill English, our 39th Prime Minister, first elected to Parliament in 1990, Finance Minister from 2008 to 2016, a period of rapid development of our society and our economy that he presided over. 2018, he was made a Knight Companion of the New Zealand Order of Merit. He's now a Director of Wesfarmers and the Todd Corporation, I understand, and a regular advisor to the governments of New Zealand and Australia. And keeping order between them is Jonathan Ayling, the Chief Executive Officer of the Free Speech Union and the dynamo who basically runs everything. So what we are proposing to do is that for the next hour, these two will entertain and inform you about their thoughts and opinions on a variety of questions that Jonathan will put to them. The last 20 minutes of the session will be questions from the floor, anything you want to put to them. Would you please put your hands together for our two guests?
Well, good evening, everyone. Thank you so much for being here. I just want to acknowledge members of the public service here, including Commissioner Andrew Costa, members of Parliament, former members of Parliament, members of the media. Can you hear me? Is this on? No? Did you turn it off, Roderick? You turned it off. There we are. Welcome, everyone. It's been my pleasure in the role as Chief Executive of the Free Speech Union to interview a number of senior international personalities, but I think tonight takes the cake. It is a pleasure to be joined by such eminent commentators, both internationally and domestically. And most of you will have seen the media that has already started to emerge around the tour that Lord Sumption has been making here in New Zealand. The Q&A interview has ruffled a few feathers on numerous fronts and various other comments he's made while here. So we'll just jump into this conversation. We'll orientate primarily towards the key interests of the Free Speech Union tonight around free speech, obviously, but that does get us into a number of cans of worms. So we'll see where we'll land. It'll be fun, I think. Lord Sumption, you claim that free speech and the values, the liberal values, I guess, more generally, that underpin free speech are increasingly under threat. I think this is probably most particularly true in the Anglosphere. Why do you think that is the case?
Well, before I try and answer that question, perhaps I could find out whether my loudspeaker is working. No, it is? So I can be heard at the back. I don't think there's a single cause for this. It's very complicated. But the basic premise of any liberal democracy is that people have to care more about the procedure for deciding issues than they do about winning any particular issue. In other words, they have to be prepared to accept democratic outcomes that they may not like. Now, that is intimately connected, I think, with the issue of free speech. What has happened is, I think, mainly due to the fact that many people, and particularly the younger generation, have lost confidence in democracy as a method of resolving issues. There are quite a large number of reasons for that. One of them is the current economic climate. The disappointment of expectations is a very dangerous moment in the life of any liberal democracy. It was the reason why so many Europeans turned to despots and fascists in between the wars, historical experience suggests that that is the moment when institutions and respect for institutions tends to crumble. I think that the young are particularly affected by this. It's widely believed that they will not enjoy the same opportunities as their parents did. And I think that there is a tendency for them to feel that democracy stacks the odds against them on issues like climate change, which affect them much more seriously than they affect others of the older generation. So those, I think, are some of the reasons. But it's too complicated a phenomenon to lend itself to oversimple explanations.
Certainly, we haven't escaped the phenomenon here in New Zealand. And polling that was released by the Free Speech Union about 2 months ago showed that 75% of adult Kiwis believe with the statement that free speech is a defining cultural value. And we consider that to be quite strong support across the population for the idea of free speech. You dig down into that and assess what free speech means and whether it includes things like hate speech, there might be a lower number. But there was still strong support. However, 51% of Kiwis believe that free speech is under threat. So they agree with the prognosis that there is a threat for the various reasons that may be the case. Sir Bill, I speak with the Simon Wilsons of the world, and not by choice for the most part, but they come around and they scoff and they say that our polling must be wrong, or even if our polling isn't wrong, the people who say that there is a problem are wrong. Why do you think there is real hesitancy amongst certain populations in New Zealand to accept that maybe free speech is under threat?
I think it's to some extent a matter of who they talk to. I spent a bit of time in Australia, and they've just had a referendum over there on a very challenging and difficult issue around the voice. And I was speaking to one of a supporter who said, look, I haven't spoken to any Australian who was opposed to the voice. And I thought, well, that's the problem. You never have. And perhaps some of the people who think there's no problem just aren't getting out enough. We know there's these sort of social media-driven theories of bubbles, and part of an environment where free speech comes under challenge is precisely that you don't mix or debate with people who disagree with you, because you may have very condescending view, or that you occupy a certain geographical area where there just isn't anyone who isn't like that. And I think it's a great counter to it, and it's a challenge, I think, right across the political spectrum. Whatever those forces are that have you locked into a bubble, I think one of the things you can do about all this is break out of it yourself, because to some extent we all exist in sort of defined communities. But that's one of the more proactive, useful things you can do.
And I wondered how long we would be in this conversation before social media came up. It turns out not very long. And it is something in the conversation around free speech, we quickly turn to the liberating impact that social media has been able to have in giving more people voice, but also the negative aspects of that as well. Lord Sumption, do you think social media is driving us into bubbles more than previously existed, or are we more aware of it now and bubbles have always existed?
Well, bubbles have always existed, and social media amplify feelings that are already there. But obviously they make the situation very much more difficult. First of all, because they have the capacity to produce instant mass outrage. And there's been no way of doing that quite so quickly before. Secondly, because the algorithms under which social media operate have the effect of reinforcing existing prejudices and connecting people with the views of those who agree with them rather than the views of those who might challenge them. And that produces a monochrome attitude to the world. It eliminates nuance and it certainly eliminates dissent. We can't censor the internet, so there is no obvious cure for this condition other than to encourage, in particularly young people who are the main users of the social media, an attitude of skepticism towards information that they receive from any source. The skepticism may be more easily overcome from what one can loosely call respectable sources, but skepticism about what one is told is the basic condition for any intelligent analysis of what goes on in the world.
The claim we can't censor the internet is one where many governments around the world are damn well going to try nonetheless.
Including mine.
Indeed, with the Online Safety Bill in the UK, the Digital Services Act in the EU, Sir Bill, even in Australia right now, legislation has been passed at the federal level that is frankly Orwellian to address mis and disinformation. I don't want to get ahead of myself. That's quite a substantial topic to address in itself. But is it true that the internet is uncensorable, or do you think that there is actually a way to do this, either at all, or hopefully in a way that we also manage to preserve some of the liberties that we take for granted as well?
I think you can't avoid a messy process of trying to find the socially acceptable and legitimate answer to that problem. Can you censor the internet? Of course, there's some things on it you would want to censor, and there's people get dealt to by the law for, extreme child pornography and so on because their laptop got picked up at the airport and someone had a look at it and found the material. So we already do censor it. So the argument really is not so much can you censor it? Well, yes, of course you can. China runs a firewall. The argument is really what is the, as I think Lord Sumption's already said, what is the kind of legitimate process by which decisions get made about that? I think governments who kind of leap to a disinformation, misinformation view of the world run the risk of undermining their legitimacy by overextending what they're doing. And I think the right process for it to be, for those decisions to be made is this one. That is, what is a broadly acceptable view of where the boundary may be shifted to? But just keep in mind the basic facts. It is censored, there is law that applies, and the question is who gets to decide how far that goes.
The boundary, wherever you draw it, has got to be sufficiently clear to be enforced. Otherwise, it's not a boundary at all. Obviously, it's right that illegal content like child pornography should be excluded from the internet, and by and large it is. The problem arises when you go beyond that kind of thing, plainly illegal material, and try to move on to undesirable material, because undesirability is in the eye of the beholder. It's not
lawful but awful.
Yes, well, it's not a subject on which people are ever going to agree. And it seems to me that the only answer to that is to let it rip, because the alternative is either a a government-inspired elimination of all risky material. All censorship tends towards the mediocre middle. It eliminates the really original ideas. So that will either be done on the basis of official action, which I think would be very unfortunate, or it will be done on the basis of self-censorship by the organisers of the social media, which is arguably even more sinister because they will take no risks at all with their own position and will tend to censor even more than officials do.
Certainly in New Zealand, we've experienced this with the introduction of various voluntary codes. While voluntary action is preferable to mandated legislation, the problem with some of these is it gives a big stick to activists who want to go around and thump on those who are expressing original thought. And social media companies are proving to be more and more risk adverse, and so they jump at that. When we discuss regulating the internet or the harm that can come through social media and free speech associated with it, there are some that believe that the state of free speech is inferior or is losing status more quickly in the Anglosphere, so in the United Kingdom, in Canada, South Africa, Australia, New Zealand, than in other parts of the West or indeed other parts of the globe more generally. Do you think that is true, Lord Sumption?
Yes, I think it is true that this has been more vigorous in the Anglosphere than elsewhere. And that is, I think, in part because the Anglosphere is really the heart of modern liberal democracy. The countries of continental Europe, for example, have not experienced this to anything like the same degree. And one reason for that is that they have always had a somewhat more authoritarian cultural tradition.
Is that because of Catholic influence?
No, I think it's because of the political tradition that has developed in the course of a very different historical experience over the past century and a half or 2 centuries. But for whatever reason, I think it is noticeable that this is primarily a problem of the Anglosphere. And it is quite interesting to notice that the Pew Research Institute, which has been conducting polls internationally on the views about democracy, among other issues, for many years now, has identified a tendency to despise democracy, which is strongest in the classic liberal democracies of the Anglosphere and strongest among the younger generation, people under 35. Now, I would love to be able to understand more than I do about the reasons for that. But the phenomenon is quite clearly exists.
Certainly, from the perspective of the Free Speech Union, the Free Speech Union New Zealand was the first to emerge outside of Britain. We have a sister organisation in the UK that was there from the outset, and then we've been joined more recently in South Africa with the Free Speech Union, and we're launching an FSU Australia next month. Sir Bill, I wonder, looking at a domestic context, there's the saying, when America sneezes, the whole world catches a cold. But I'm more concerned as we look at Justin Trudeau's amendments of hate speech laws in Canada, and we look at the mis and disinformation laws in Australia, we look at the online safety bill in the UK. How do we stop in New Zealand being imitators of these other countries in the Anglosphere that we are prone towards wanting to look alike?
Well, the Free Speech Union managed to get hundreds of submissions into the Select Committee.
Tens of thousands.
Tens of thousands. Which I assume...
That would be misinformation otherwise.
I assume we're opposed to the legislation that was being put up. But I think that is what... what's moved the dial towards less free speech is a vigorous activism on the one hand by individuals, quite fairly specific groups, and also a kind of takeover of the kind of institutions, being the media and our tertiary institutions, who have the sort of time and intellectual capacity to think about all this stuff in some detail and can afford the enforcement. Right? If you're in a business, you're not hiring managers to enforce limited speech in your business because you can't afford it and you haven't got time and they're busy doing their stuff. So institutions that used to advocate for free speech, like if you went back to the 60s, our universities were hotbeds of dissent, and now they're hotbeds of conformism. And I'm not quite sure how that's happened, but it has, and I think that kind of weights the scales against free speech. You want to go and look at some of the video of the 60s and anti-war and the Springbok tour stuff here. I mean, that was vigorous dissent. There's actually less of that kind of vigorous dissent now, and it's partly because these arguments have become pretty intellectual, with the exception of the threat of force that says if you run this event, I'm going to shut it down by coming in and disrupting it. But I think it's the same kind of vigorous activism that's required to rebalance the scales, because politicians will listen to that. And if you take an optimistic view, and I always think the positive proposition is what's influential, I think you're seeing a bit of a adjustment go on now, where the parts of our community that have been prone to stepping back from free speech, certainly in Australia, they're shocked by a referendum result where they didn't really hear a lot of intensive debate, but it lost by a long way. And that's going to reverberate, because what it tells them is people are thinking a lot of things they're not articulating. And this is part of the beauty of our democratic process. The silent majority get to have a say occasionally and push back.
Indeed, I'm thinking of whether I should say something or not. But free speech, I'm thinking about comments that the likes of Dita Daboni made on News Hub Nation the day after the election. I wonder, though not to the same extent as The Voice, here in New Zealand even, I do wonder whether there's an element of elite commentators not in contact with those that aren't expressing themselves as vigorously, and there needs to be a recalibration there.
The most interesting thing about it, surely, is that at the beginning of the campaign, when the project was announced, there was significant majority support for it. That turned around in the course of the debate. Now, that suggests to me that people were thinking very seriously about it for themselves. Having begun by accepting the cliches, they ended by engaging in some detailed analysis. That's very cheering.
A standard legal test is what the reaction of the man on the Clapham omnibus would be to a particular set of events. Lord Sumption, you mentioned in your Q&A interview earlier this week that part of assessing the threat of public disorder from certain speech would be to ask if a reasonable person would be likely to be animated to pursue disorderly actions as a result of that speech. Of course, Clapham is very foreign to us in New Zealand, as is an omnibus, and I'm beginning to wonder whether reason is foreign at times as well. How is the standard test still helpful in a day where our values and our beliefs as a society have become so diverse and often so incompatible that the definition of a reasonable person is as varied as those who might express it?
Well, there's more to it than just a reasonable person. Common law countries have historically adopted a common approach to this kind of issue. The object of the common law has always been to preserve public order rather than to censor unwelcome opinions. So what do you do when an unwelcome opinion is being expressed which may threaten public order? Most countries, and this I think also applies to New Zealand, most common law countries have a test which requires that the person who is speaking should actually intend to provoke disorder, or the circumstances should be such that any rational person in his position must be taken to intend that result. Now, you can say things that are deeply offensive to people without actually the natural result being that they are going to engage in riots. And we cannot have a situation in which the mere threat of a riot is a sufficient basis for public authorities to shut down the expression of certain opinions. So I think there are two requirements. One is the requirement that the Speaker should intend to create disorder, and the other is the requirement that reasonable people in the position of those who are hearing him would react violently to what he's saying.
We've seen a troubling trend in New Zealand over the past 5 years or so, generally, that the Free Speech Union has responded to on a number of occasions around what would be called either the heckler's veto or the thug's veto. A few very prominent cases this year alone. In response to that, the Free Speech Union drafted legislation that has been endorsed by the National Party, the New Zealand First Party, and the ACT Party. So we're quite confident it will, in fact, be included in legislation next year that places a positive duty on public venues to allow those who might express provocative opinions to retain their free speech, and that the thug's veto can't shut them down simply because others might threaten a riot. People say, well, but what if people are threatening disorder? What happens then? And we've said, well, that's the role of the police. Is that a correct response, Lord Sumption? Is it correct to say, well, if someone is expressing themselves in a way that isn't necessarily deliberately provocative, but is offensive to a certain group, and a certain group is moved towards potential disorder, is that the role of the police then to ensure lawful activity?
Yes, of course it is. If somebody is within the very broad limits permitted by the principle of free speech, then the police ought to intervene to make sure that he is not silenced by the mere threat of coercion. I don't wish to go in detail to what happened to Posey Parker in this country a few weeks ago, but on the face of it, it looks as if the police didn't do a great deal. By comparison, in the UK, a very well-known, very prominent philosophy professor called Kathleen Stock, who is a gender-critical philosopher, spoke in Oxford at the Oxford Union, notwithstanding threats that she would be prevented from opening her mouth. And that was achieved by the police simply being required, under pressure in part from ministers, to bring sufficient hundreds of reinforcements in to make sure that she was not stopped. That is the answer in a great many of these cases, but actually people howling in the streets or the thugs are not the main problem. The main problem, it comes from people, publishers, venue owners, media, who would rather have a quiet life than take a stand on this. And it's actually very difficult in practical terms to require, e.g. a venue, to give a platform to someone. You can prevent them discriminating, but in practice, if a venue says, I'm sorry, we're holding this space for Christmas musicals, what does one to say? Unless you take over the commercial choices of these venues, there's nothing, I think, that the law can effectively do about it. What is actually required is not more law, but a change in our culture. And that's obviously a great deal more difficult to achieve.
I think the general sentiment following the Posey Parker affair was that the police did not function in the way that they were supposed to. But it's worth noting, the Free Speech Union coordinated a public letter to the Minister of Police and the Police Commissioner that was signed by tens of thousands. And when Posey Parker was set to return to the country and when there was a sentencing of her assailant, police operated in a very different manner. And so I think we have hopefully seen some reflection on that experience. Sir Bill, it makes me wonder. I understand you've had something of a moderate interest in politics here in New Zealand over the past couple of decades, and the tradition, or the traditional conception at least, of liberalism is inextricably connected to the idea of reason. Is it fair to suggest that the rise of illiberalism that we're seeing, and from that we see a dissent and opposition to free speech, is it coming from embracing dogmatic ideology rather than discursive reason, or where is this coming from, and what's causing it?
I don't think we should get too thin-skinned about all this. I mean, the embrace of dogmatic ideology is not new or recent. That's one point. The second thing is people are always going to feel very strongly about some issues to the point of physical confrontation. You know, I can remember going to National Party conferences in the early 90s, surrounded by hundreds of people who were beating their fists on the window of the town hall, of the windows, trying to crowd it, trying to make so much noise that the conference couldn't proceed. And to their credit, the venue operators didn't say, we're not going to allow this event to go ahead because of health and safety. In fact, it was a bracing experience as a politician to confront face-to-face people who felt they were being disadvantaged by decisions that the system was making and shouting in your face about what you should do about it or get out of here in slightly more urgent language. And so let's leave enough ground for all that to happen.
If I may, then, what's different now than in that situation, though, was that the consequences of health and safety issues emerging didn't fall on the venue. And so we've created an environment where venues are hyper-risk adverse because they are held responsible if some nut job does throw a brick through the window. Is the law and partially at fault there?
Yeah, well, that's not a free speech problem, is it? That's a problem of which I think that we're all familiar with, that whenever an issue arises in New Zealand and other places, we think if we pass the law, it's all going to go away. And usually it doesn't, and we overdo it. So are people who disagree with me unreasonable? Yes, of course. I'm the reasonable one. They're the unreasonable one. But I've found over the years unreasonable people change the world precisely because they're unreasonable. So I think expecting everyone to behave in a manner that is reasonable is just far too high a bar. And if we think their unreasonable behaviour is anti-free speech, well, I just don't agree with that. I mean, these processes are messy, uncertain, somewhat unpredictable, but over time we've been able to resolve lots of fundamental problems in our societies, these Anglo societies, without going to war with each other. Because up until pretty recently, that's what they did. You know, religious differences in Britain led to hundreds of years of conflict. And what were they arguing about? Right? Well, they were arguing about some reasonably esoteric ideas, but they felt strongly enough to kill each other pretty regularly. So we've done a lot better, and I think that's the context in which we should see all this. You know, the counterfactual to a messy, unreasonable process of shouting at each other is Gaza.
I grew up in Mozambique shortly after it transitioned from communism to democracy. And so I always feel like I've had a slightly more tangible experience of the alternative. But while we have done very well, does it take very long to erode? Is it possible? Look, something as we were walking in, you said my impression is that things are going to get much worse before they get better. Not to leave you with a bit of a downer tonight, but can things unravel quite quickly from here?
Well, I think that we have to start out by recognising that tolerance does not come naturally to human beings. What has happened is that since, I think, sometime in the 17th century, we have been developing a very successful culture which has led people to behave in a way that is not characteristic of humanity at all. It's an artificial construct which has been the product of wisdom, experience, law, and a culture which is important but fragile. What is happening now, and the reason why I find it hard to be optimistic, is that we are reverting to the way that people thought before the 17th century, when it was felt that a society could not decently hold more than one opinion on any significant subject, and that it was therefore the function of society in general to determine what the opinion of absolutely everybody would be There are lots of parallels, I think, between the intolerance shown on the kind of issues we've been talking about now and the intolerance which people saw every day of their lives in, for example, the 16th century. The issues about which we're intolerant may be different, but the phenomenon is the same. So it's actually a regression to an earlier and less attractive world that we are witnessing.
2 weeks ago, a declaration was released called the Westminster Declaration. It was a public statement of over 130 journalists, authors, academics and activists condemning the weaponization of the terms mis and disinformation that we've seen emerge relatively recently. It's signed by the likes of individuals Richard Dawkins, Steven Pinker, Jonathan Haidt, and I was asked to sign it, which I don't know why they asked me to, but I was quite gratified by that. It reads, coming from the left, right and centre, there were 130 people, and I would encourage you, if you're going to sort the signatures, to sort it by alphabetize it, because, you know, Jonathan Ayling, you'll come across me first. It reads, coming from the left, right and centre, we are united by our commitment to universal human rights and freedom of speech, and we are deeply concerned at the attempts to label protected speech as misinformation, disinformation, and other ill-defined terms. Lord Sumption, it would occur to me that mis and disinformation are hardly new concepts, even if the way we're constructing those concepts and expressing them are slightly different. So what other terms have existed for what we now call mis and disinformation? Heresy might come to mind. And more importantly, who have been the belligerents who seek to suppress speech and ideas through them?
As I understand it, the Westminster Declaration was a protest against the kind of censorship which in the United Kingdom was envisaged by the Online Safety Bill and in other jurisdictions has been envisaged by those who seek to establish control over the internet. The problem about misinformation is that what it inevitably does is impose on people a conventional view. Conventional views, the challenge to conventional views is one of the basic mechanisms by which civilization advances. There was a time when it was the conventional view was that the sun revolved around the world. There was a time when views not just about religion but about the natural world were regarded as proper matters for authority to decide and not for individuals to speculate. We know a great deal more now because we are less respectful of conventional views. So the authors of the Declaration are plainly absolutely right to object to any amount, any attempt to define misinformation by authority and eliminate it. We have to remember that we have to tolerate an enormous number of lies, an enormous number of misleading statements, some of which will no doubt be deeply offensive to many people, because that is the price we pay for the ability to discover truth in the face of mistaken conventions.
More domestically, the disinformation project has almost formed the counter of the Westminster Declaration, and they've heralded themselves as the great crusaders against the perils of a free-thinking public. But it seems that, at least in their case, they've blotted their book once too many and have lost a lot of public legitimacy. But, Sir Bill, I think there remains a highly elitist view that the public often can't be trusted to share information amongst themselves. Are we walking into a more elitist way of thinking and accessing information here in New Zealand?
We would be if we allowed publicly funded entities to arbitrate on misinformation or disinformation. I think it's a false construct, and I just love those examples where they turn out to be wrong in censoring someone else's. But look, but I don't have any problem at all with if someone sets themselves up as a voluntary or privately operated entity that says, I'm going to fact check everybody and tell you when they're wrong. Well, that's quite a legitimate function. And often the arguments are about the facts. Which fact is it? And I think the public have got a healthy scepticism about government's ability, because governments, particularly in these days of kind of public relations and corporate communication styles, far too willing and able to control information flows. I happen to think it's worse in Australia than it is here. We're a bit more open. But that is a massive form of taxpayer-funded, sometimes, disinformation. They're just telling you stuff that's wrong, or they're not telling you the thing that's right. I don't know if you saw the story this morning I bought the newspaper the first time in about 10 years, because there was a story on the front page about the number of children who died in the care of SIFs, number of child deaths over the last 5 or 6 years. And the newspaper did the right thing. They told the story about how they tried to get this information through the OIA. It was refused, and then it turned up in a white envelope, anonymous. So some official decided that free speech was going to help, and it showed the pretty startling information that 57 children had died, murdered, not died, killed. It's something we need to know, but something that the agency tried to hide. Well, I don't know if that's going to turn up in the disinformation project. It damn well should, but you and I both know it won't, because that project is that's a public institution that's not going to criticise other public institution. It's going to criticise mad people out in the suburbs who don't believe what the government says, or provincial people who drive tractors down the main street to protest about carbon and regulation and safety and everything that irritates them in their daily life, and half of what they believe about that's wrong, but that's what they do. So my point here is if that starts getting institutionalised, then you've only got to look at those institutions and societies that have been very successful at controlling misinformation, and it's called dictatorship. I mean, it's China, it's Romania under the communist regime. That's where it goes. So you're better with the messy environment, as Lord Sumption described. There's lots of lies, lots of mistakes, but the process by which you deal with that is truth-seeking, not control.
That leads us into a whole other conversation around the state of the OIA and whether it's a functional system at all at the moment, but for another day. When the United States and Britain were connected across the Atlantic in the 19th century by the telegram, there was great consternation. They said it was going to make the sharing of information too fast for the truth, and that only error and rumour would be transmitted. And it seems clear every improvement in technology enhances our ability to access fact as well as error. Lord Sumption, the invention of the printing press, of course, led to a horrifically bloody period in Europe. What options do we have to address the threat of error being presented as fact without embracing censorship in an internet age?
None at all. I think that the only way to deal with this is simply to challenge things that we don't agree with.
Counter-speech.
Exactly. We advance by challenging what we regard as misinformation, and not by trying to suppress it, because some of that misinformation will turn out to be useful and true.
We discussed earlier the hate speech campaign that the Free Speech Union run, the largest public policy consultation that was ever run in New Zealand, and the second largest was just recently, 3 months ago, against the Department of Internal Affairs proposals to introduce hate speech laws for the internet. Subil, I wonder, do you accept that? Does the internet and does social media present unprecedented challenges that need unprecedented responses, or is this a storm in a teacup that we're making too much of?
I don't think it's a storm in a teacup, but it's by no means unprecedented. I mean, if you think of changes that led to a big shift in the capacity of people to communicate and interchange views. You just think of the period from sort of mid-1800s to the early 1900s, where you got electricity, telegraph, air travel, cars. Those were massive changes. Whole ways of life disappeared, and the parts of the world where on a continental mass were able to move wherever they could, and they proceeded to do that over the next 100 years. So in that context, the internet's just another version. Yes, it certainly sped things up, and it gives lots of people an audience who couldn't otherwise get an audience. But I don't think it changes the nature of the solutions, which I think is the point that Lord Sumption's just making. And the Free Speech Union is exactly an example of that. So in the old days, not so long ago, you'd have to join a political party to influence this kind of debate, because it was hard. That was the kind, and other sort of organisations, but you had to create some kind of community, and actually it was reasonably challenging to do that. You had to join join organisations and turn up to meetings. Well, now you just click the button and you're in. Click the button and you gave your $5. Click the button and you can read the email, all sitting in the comfort of your kitchen.
Do you hear how easy it is to donate to the Free Speech Union? All you have to do, click the button and donate your money.
See, my point is that the internet provides the balancing medium for the idiots or the people you disagree with, or the thugs who are trying to veto.
It also does one thing which is absolutely unprecedented. The concern of 19th century liberals like John Stuart Mill was that the pressure of public opinion would be a much more dangerous censor of thought than government action. And what he was thinking of was the pressure of majority conventional opinion. What the internet has achieved is to create a forum in which the same effect can be produced by people who are not majority opinion, but are actually often very small minorities. The amplification effect enables minorities to oppress in a way that previously people feared would come from majorities. And that is a very radical change, and it couldn't have happened without the internet.
And going back to what you said before, the antidote to that in many ways would be courage, would be those that are not in the minority, those that are not being suppressed, but are nonetheless appearing to be reduced, to stand up. I'm a big fan of the saying stiffen spines. And on your AM interview Monday morning, you said diversity of opinion matters, and you've got to persuade publishers, venues, and broadcasters that actually they shouldn't be intimidated. The only reason why people behave like this, trying to suppress other people's views, is that experience shows that it works. And I'll quote Stephen Franks from our Free Speech Union Council. He says, we need a military wing to our union to have some people to get some courage to stand up against these things. And my question is, how have we got into this position of a society with such a deficit of courage? Sir Bill, how did we end up here?
Well, I wouldn't want to try and offer an explanation of how we ended up here, but I think how you move from here is in the first place, people who are in the positions where it matters, understanding that not exercising some courage is destructive of wider liberal values. Like if you are the person running the venue or running the publisher, then just think about the full implications of your actions, not necessarily the short-term ones. I think the other is finding, like minds across the political spectrum, and that's one of the interesting things about the Free Speech Union is you're doing that, and that actually does give people more reassurance that if they take a stand, then there's going to be a broad range of people support them on the basis of principle, rather than a kind of partisan view. I heard a podcast the other day of a Jamaican author talking about who was clearly very left-orientated and saying, well, free speech is my creativity. I want to be able to write about white characters, and I want to be able to write about black people who do bad things, because it's part of me telling stories about how the world is. So that kind of connection across, I think where the courage is this is where political leadership matters, actually. Public institutions have proven to be weak in the face of dissent. They used to foster dissent, particularly our tertiary institutions. And I think political leadership of the sort that says it's fine if you're dissenting. And that's where I think we've got to be a bit careful in this free speech argument for those who support free speech not to get too thin-skinned about someone yelling about an issue. That's not suppressing free speech. That is free speech. And sometimes the thug's right. Okay? It's just when they really threaten others, then there's boundaries around violence and what's acceptable.
I think that the essence is the diversity of opinion there, isn't it? And I often say at the Free Speech Union, we could barely agree on where to go to lunch, let alone any of the far more substantial questions that we have to deal with. But hopefully there's a path forward through bringing together those diverse perspectives. Lord Sumption, at the University of Sydney, there's an American psychologist called Professor Salvatore Bobanes, and he coined the term liberal authoritarianism, which seems oxymoronic and just perhaps simply moronic to me. The idea is that liberalism and authoritarianism are somehow compatible, and by this he's referring to the likes of perhaps the Justin Trudeau's or the Emmanuel Macron's, or even to an extent the Jacinda Ardern's of this world, who embraced a progressive identity while wielding considerable authoritarianism as well. Are these ideas, is liberalism and authoritarianism mutually exclusive?
This is a very much older idea. The classic statement of the position comes from the Marxist intellectual Herbert Marcuse, who in a famous essay in 1965 was entitled it Repressive Tolerance. And the attitude that he was, the point that he was making, which is a thoroughly bad point, but is a point that is very often too readily accepted, is that free speech and classical liberalism is in fact a form of withdrawal in the face of power. The argument is that free speech is the tool by which powerful voices drown out other voices. The problem about this view is that it regards challenge as essentially an exercise of power rather than as something which initiates or promotes an intellectual debate. That is why I think sensible people ought to reject the Marxist view, but there is actually a very common view, which I would reject entirely, that authoritarianism is a way of liberating the people whose voices are less powerful.
It takes a hatchet to the roots of the foundation you're trying to build on.
Yes, what it says basically is, and this is part of the classic Marxist analysis, that people are victims of manipulation by larger forces, and that all forms of liberty are simply giving more power to the elbows of the manipulators. Actually, what this doctrine leads to is a situation in which, when you ask yourself, who am I to believe, the only answer you're ever going to get is the person with the sharpest elbows and the loudest voice.
The Free Speech Union conducts a academic freedom survey every year, and you can't make this stuff up sometimes. We send it round to thousands and thousands of academics across the country, and we had one academic reply and say, I won't participate in your survey because the notion of freedom is a colonialist, patriarchal idea. And I'm not sure if it's occurred to them, but what is the alternative to freedom if freedom itself is colonialist and patriarchal? It shows a very sorry state of affairs. And so, Bill, you pointed that out, that does exist in our academy. In the 2023 2023 report that we released about 6 months ago, across all 8 universities, only 46% of academics agreed that they felt free to question received wisdom and state controversial or unpopular opinions. And so, Bill, it occurs to me that the definition of academic freedom that we have in the Education and Training Act is actually quite robust. The problem is it has virtually no teeth, and so we can document year on year a demise of free speech, and there can be a demonstrable and relatively widely accepted view that academic freedom is not thriving in New Zealand, but Vice-Chancellors and the Tertiary Education Commissioner simply let off their duty of doing anything about it. So how do we resolve that with academic freedom being such a crucial part of free speech, how do we try and make it foster without introducing a whole political bureaucracy that's probably going to be ineffective? You can't impose freedom on people. What's the solution?
Well, actually, 46% was quite high, I thought. I was expecting it to be around about 20%.
Well, I know.
I think that it's just the tools that you have. So one is, the employment law, where if someone... Because the problem with this really is the consequences for people, and that is they can't advance in their career or they don't get the job because they didn't say, have the right form of words in their commitment to social justice or whatever. So there's an employment law that's there. I think you're right that trying to supervise all that would be counterproductive. So in the long run, you're reliant on the market, actually. And I think it's pretty interesting that, and this connects, I think, somewhat to Lord Sumption's views about the disillusionment of young people. Universities have changed in the last 5 years. People aren't going. And it's disappointing for the people in those institutions because they get to stand up in a class. They've got 50 enrolled in a class and only 5 turn up. They're property companies with a few academics in them now, and big empty spaces. So the market's telling them that there's something wrong with their model. And I think there's 2 aspects to that. One is the actual physical structure of delivering tertiary education is way overcapitalised. But the second thing is you can't help wondering whether some of those young people would rather stay at home with their aged parents and their annoying teenage siblings and do their tertiary education from there than turn up to suffocating conformism where all they learn is what they must write in the essay so that they can get a decent mark. So I've always wondered how sustainable that model was, particularly when people pay so much to go. And I think you're starting to see a turn. The market's starting to say, actually, I don't know if this is the right way for me to spend the prime of my youth and incur debt that I'm going to carry for the next 15 years. Maybe that's the best way to solve it.
You say you were surprised at 46%. I would also note that the University of Auckland recently, an individual at the University of Auckland recently leaked to the Free Speech Union an internal survey that was done across the schools there. At the law school, 18% of the faculty felt free to express controversial opinions. So less than 1 in 5 felt they had that academic freedom. That is indeed a dismal state of affairs. Lord Sumption, as we consider the many different subjects we've considered tonight, the rise of illiberalism, basis of reason, mis and disinformation, how can we retain and advance the core tenets of liberal democracy without a robust academy that plays its role, willing to disrupt the status quo, not fearful of provocation, and inevitably tied to groupthink?
Well, you're obviously right to say that schools and universities are absolutely critical parts of our intellectual world, and particularly critical parts of the way that we train young minds. I think that the problem is that the law or politics can actually only achieve so much. In the United Kingdom, we recently passed legislation for the creation of a free speech commissioner in universities, whose function it would be to identify institutional opposition to free speech in universities and do something about it. and I wish him well. I think he's taken on an extremely difficult job. It is quite interesting that although conditions in universities are very different in different countries of the Anglosphere, this is one thing which is common to all of them. The statistics that you quote could be replicated in any American university, and I suspect, although there's no polling evidence to support it, probably in most British universities. Recent polls of students in American universities have suggested that 80% of students have felt unable to express themselves freely and obliged to adopt conventional views that are being enforced on them on really highly controversial issues. Ultimately, I'm sure that there will be a kickback. I don't think that the answer is likely to be in the market, because it seems to me that the value in employment terms of a degree is simply too great to expect people to turn en masse away from universities, least of all for this particular reason. But many of these things are in fact cyclical. When you find that 80% of students are inhibited from expressing their views, what you are going to see following that is a feeling that this is a thoroughly unpleasant world to be in. And the answer may not be to withdraw to one's home and leave universities to their own devices, but simply to put pressure on universities to improve. I'm sure that that will happen. The question is the time frame. Sooner or later, all loopy ideas like the ones that we are witnessing at universities disappear. And this one will eventually, but I wouldn't bet on it happening anytime very soon.
Paul Hunt is the Chief Human Rights Commissioner, or if David Seymour has his way, at least the outgoing Chief Human Rights Commissioner. And Paul Hunt and I have had quite an amicable relationship. We've got an ongoing disagreement, though, and whenever we've sat on a public panel together or met to discuss speech rights, he insists that all human rights are equal, that no one is superior to another. On the other hand, that seems ludicrous to me, and I insist that human rights needs to be built on a framework that has a hierarchy on which free speech is its foundation and inextricably connected to the respect for conscience and belief. Lord Sumption, on Monday evening we held an event with the Legal Research Foundation in Auckland, and you suggested there are two categories of fundamental rights, and that the proliferation of human rights, each as vital as the one that preceded it, undermines the democratic process. Why did you say this?
Well, it's obviously not true to say that all human rights are of equal value. They can't be, for one very obvious reason, which is that all human rights are qualified. That's to say that all the main human rights instruments, the Universal Declaration and so on, accept that there are, in particular circumstances, there may be countervailing public interests which have to prevail over the classic human rights, and that includes free speech. So the circumstances in which human rights become important are far too varied to permit a hierarchy. An apparently unimportant right may assume enormous importance in some circumstances, and the other way around. Free speech is significant because so many other things depend on it. Our public institutions depend on it. Our ability to educate the younger generation depend on it. Our ability to maintain the kind of discourse about truth which is fundamental to our ability to function as a democracy. So I would put free speech pretty close to the top of any hierarchy, but that's a long way from saying that it must always prevail.
So, Bill, New Zealand, as you know, is one of the oldest continuous democracies in New Zealand, and we have a mixed but, I would say, largely positive history of human rights, one that, for the most part, we can be proud of. Our society accepts and insists on the democratic form of government that operate with due regard for these beliefs. Do you think this culture, though, is waxing or waning? How can we work to ensure that we continue to maintain this belief in a human rights framework that does value free speech?
Well, I think by paying attention to where it stops being useful. If you think of, say, the problem with the human rights discourse is it ends up saying everything is a human right, like there's a human right to housing, for instance. Well, there may be, but that means obligations on someone to deliver it, and then it becomes a human right to a particular type of housing. Say, and we've been through this discussion over the last 10 years, one way or another. And so I think most people would say, well, actually, that's just a practical issue. Of course, people should have a house, but how they get it is, and what it costs, and what they give up to get it, is a whole set of complex issues. In fact, ones which I think we need to resolve to reduce the extent to which younger people feel alienated by the system. Actually, I think it's a good practical political reason to resolve that particular issue. But how does New Zealand keep it up? Well, I think in the first place, remembering that there have been some real successes from the marginal voice that has upset the status quo. If you just think of the position of Māori in New Zealand, that's changed quite significantly going right back to the marches in the 1960s through to where things are today. All our attitudes have changed, and mostly for the better. Not always, but mostly for the better. So we are a society that's found ways of dealing with some quite difficult identity issues and sort of political structure issues, which other countries have found incredibly difficult and often failed. And hopefully we keep making progress. So I think that's the first thing, that the free speech process can lead to progress, not just lies in the public arena. And we should reinforce that. But then, of course, who's on the margin changes over time. And I often think what works in public life is listening to the people who make you uncomfortable, and who that is keeps shifting. And so in more recent times, it's, say, people who are really disillusioned with what the school system is giving to their kids. And more of them are opting out. That's uncomfortable. And off the back of the whole COVID episode, there's lots of different voices who what they say I don't agree with, and I don't agree with it quite a lot. And it makes me feel uncomfortable, and I think, actually, I should be listening to that, because this is the process by which either we accept or reject those marginal voices. Now, does everyone want to listen to things that make them feel uncomfortable and challenged? Well, clearly some people don't, and they just happen to be people in institutions that are fairly dominant on our landscape, like the media. There's quite a lot of journalists who do not want to hear your opinion if it's different from the prevailing view. I don't think they'll last, actually. So again, I'm a bit optimistic. I think there's self-correcting mechanisms. Lord Sumption talks about it as cyclical, and they will kick in because people living their lives with their families, keeping their jobs, take a fairly pragmatic view of what's going to work in their lives and what's going to keep their community orderly. Why do we watch crime? Why is there so much crime on TV? Well, part of it is it's a consistent little amber light warning system. If you don't resolve your personal issues or your community issues, this is what will happen. It's endless, isn't it? Cop shows, law shows, they just go on and on and on. Why? We keep watching them. And we're not, well, most of us aren't involved with the law, I don't think, in a negative way. Well, certainly Lord Sumption is. So I'd be optimistic about it. I think we've got, we've kind of just stable enough, and I think others have a more negative view that we're sort of tipping over an edge. I'm not quite there yet.
Speaking at the end of the Free Speech Union debate series about a month ago up in Auckland, I had a PhD student about to complete his PhD in law come up and disagree with a lot of what he had heard that night. And he said, Jonathan, the basic fact of the matter is, I don't think I should have to hear opinions that I don't like. And so I'm not sure how well our academy or our law profession will continue to do in those sorts of environments. Just before we go to questions from the floor, Lord Sumption, you've had a distinguished and varied career across several professions. Sir Bill, you've done all right in life, I guess. Neither you or I are legally trained, though, and there's probably disagreement on whether we're better for it or not. But certainly, in this space we work with a lot of lawyers, and to a hammer, everything's a nail. To many lawyers, all the prescriptions have to be legal ones. To politicians, everything's politics. The question I have, though, is what role does culture have to play? Which is very hard to manufacture. You can manufacture culture, but it's hard work, it takes a long time, and at a certain level people have to buy into it. And I wonder, just before we go to the floor, so often when we look at the ills in our society, we believe that we must legislate against it, or that there must be a public policy response. But so often these inextractable societal questions can't be dealt with unless we have leadership that creates a culture that inculcates values and desires within individuals. So as leaders, how do you inculcate values in people to entice them into believing, in this case, in free speech?
Well, education is obviously critical. But one thing I think which is very dangerous is the belief that public institutions can achieve a great deal to improve the situation in which we now find ourselves, because public institutions have very little control over the culture of the societies over which they preside, and ultimately the only way that they can achieve very much is by the kind of coercive measures which all of us here, if we believe in free speech, are opposed to. It's not an easy thing. The problem about lawyers is that they believe that law is frightfully important. And it's frightfully important to some things, but not to the issues that we have been discussing. There are limits to what the law can achieve. And the only answer is that people like you have got to go banging on about free speech indefinitely, because you can change the climate. You have to be extremely patient. It won't happen overnight. But a mixture of reasonable voices and backlash against the problems created by unreasonable voices will see to it in the end. What I can't tell you is how long it will take.
Oh, one thing we could do is appoint Lord Sumption to our Supreme Court. He's well qualified. Look, I just think of what is a sort of a simple way that people with some influence, whether it's in a business or a public organisation or certainly in politics, and I'd say that this is a bit counter to the current view, but it's trust the people. We've got this overlay of managerialism, including lawyerism, of which there's just too much of it. And there's a lot of well-educated people, well-intentioned, who have got a very instrumental view of how they can influence or create a better society. And I just love it when that society defies those designs. So we've got to keep doing that. But when I say trust the people, that is, people have an amazing capability to sort out the conflict and controversies that they encounter in their families and households in the first place, because they can't avoid those, and in their community, and kind of working out how to live with something that's less than satisfactory but keeps things pretty orderly. And I think we need to see more of it. I know in our work we work with families with chronic disability in their households, and they are constantly underestimated by the system about their capability of deciding what's important for them and deciding how, as a person with a disability, you fit into a community that's not designed for you. So like every day there's sharp edges that you've got to get round. And they do. And the Human Rights Commissioner probably isn't that relevant actually to how they make for it. So that would be, so how do you inculcate those values? Well, you inculcate it by doing things, right? Otherwise it's just an opinion with no consequence. And in New Zealand, which is pretty statist, we always end up with a better result if we trust the people and allow them to do things to solve problems rather than us, people like me sitting around in public policy forums coming up with another commissioner and another regulation.
Well, now we'll put that advice into practice and listen to the people, though I'm going to automatically buck what we've just been told we should do and try and prescribe something for you guys as we listen to you. We'd love to hear some of your questions. We've got about 15 minutes left. If we could have questions, that would be ideal. We don't want to listen to monologues. If we could listen to your questions, that would be fantastic. So we've got a mic that's going to roam around, and we'll come down here to the front.
Hello, Graham Edgler. Thank you for being here. I think we all have a general aversion to regulation of speech matters, and I just had an interest whether either of you have an area where actually that's a bit of speech, or that's an area of regulation of speech that we should actually restrict more, and sort of wondered if there was and what it might have been.
I think the current settings aren't too bad, actually. Because there is stuff that should be dealt with, and people who, cross a line. The thing is, you've got to understand what it is, and I think that's a bit misunderstood at the moment. And the consequences should be proportional under the law, not disproportionate.
The things that are perfectly legitimately censored are breaches of the law. The law is not always wise, but it should always be clear. And if there are things which are plainly illegal, child pornography is a classic example, then they should be censored. And the problem arises if you have populist pressures to expand the domain of law into all sorts of other areas which are very much more debatable, because then you find yourself suppressing a broad range of perfectly legitimate opinion. But this goes to one of the fundamental problems of democracy, how to recognize the existence of powers while inculcating a culture of restraint about their actual use.
Lord Sumption, tēnā koe te kaiwhakawā. You've spoken tonight about the generational disillusionment with democracy and liberal values, and also about the dynamic in universities in the modern age around censorship and free speech. Given that there have been comments tonight about current universities becoming more illiberal or more critical of liberal values, and even as echo chambers, I'm interested in whether your thoughts on whether support in the judiciary for liberal conceptions of free speech might diminish over time as we appoint more and more judges who've been educated at these modern universities.
I hope not, and I think not. Judges, certainly in common law systems, will have been practitioners for many years. They have a large measure of accumulated experience to add to whatever they learnt at universities. Judges, certainly in the common law world, have a strong inbuilt belief in freedom of speech. And on the whole, I think both in the UK and in New Zealand, they have exercised that power in a way that has promoted it. In the United Kingdom, the Court of Appeal has, for example, made it perfectly clear that those who dismiss employees on the grounds that their fellow employees don't like their opinions on issues such as transgender will find themselves at the receiving end of large damages claims. But ultimately, as I've said, I've heard wearingly often in the course of this evening, there are limits to what the law can achieve without a background of culture. But the answer to your question, are judges going to lose the plot and start behaving differently? My view is no, they're not.
Jim Donovan. My concern is around the public service and its role in free speech. We've talked about academia, education system, etc., but one of the things that concerns me is that within the public service we are seeing the same censorious behaviours, which is stifling both ideas and the challenge of groupthink. What would be your proposals on that area?
Oh, change the government. But I think that's number one factor is the political leadership, because it can shift the direction of the public service by signalling what matters. So if what matters is talk, then the talk is all shuffled to the front and the doers get shuffled to the back and disappear. We're in a phase in New Zealand where now the public's decided that what happens is more important than what you say, because I've had a crack at what you say. Now they just want stuff to happen. And if the political direction reflects that, then you'll get that change in the public service. There's some arguments it's very difficult to win with public service and with ministers of any party, and that is that the best antidote to the institutional dynamics you're talking about is free flow of information. And public servants and ministers spend far too much time trying to control that flow of information. My own view is that the public trust the public service when they're honest about what happens and why. Things go wrong, they can say so and explain what they're going to do to fix it. Things go right, well then, like the rest of us, they're free to talk their book. So I'd say political leadership can change it, and the free flow of information and transparency can change it. And the other reason transparency changes it is because what the public want from the public service is not conformity of opinion, it's immunisations, getting treated at the ED, having reasonable regulations that they have confidence in and comply with. The public are not interested in the opinions of public servants. And again, I hope we're going into a phase where that balance is going to shift.
If I can just add to that, I'm sure it's true that the public are not interested in the opinions of public servants, but I think that the questioner has actually lighted upon a very important issue, which is the danger that a minority within the public service may produce a collective atmosphere shared throughout the public service, that certain ideas are unacceptable in a public service. And that is, I think, a dangerous situation, not because it's liable to influence public attitudes, but because it's liable to affect the way that public servants do their job. But I think that I would agree with you about the solution to this. Political leadership is absolutely critical here. What goes on in the civil service is correctable by the ordinary disciplinary processes, which are the responsibility not of civil servants but of ministers.
I've got a question for international guest, because the matter is of international significance and it kind of got legally stuck in the UK, which is the case of Julian Assange. I was wondering whether you could share your perspective on it. Thank you.
Julian Assange is in difficulties, to put it mildly, because he aided and abetted the theft of a large amount of confidential information belonging to the US government. There is a school of thought which says that governments have no business, since they are representatives of the public interest in having secrets. Julian Assange is part of that school of thought. I am not. I think that there are many ways, many areas, particularly in relation to security and military operations, which was the subject matter of the leaks that Julian Assange got into difficulty over. There are many contexts in which governments are entitled to have secrets, and in which their effectiveness is severely compromised if they can't. So I'm afraid that I have absolutely no sympathy for Julian Assange at all. I'm all in favour of fearless reporting. I am not in favour of theft.
We'll just have one last question.
Yes, Lord Sumption. You mentioned that our tolerant culture arose about 300 years ago from the status quo. I wonder if you have any insights into what caused that and whether those elements can be applied in today's age.
Sorry, can you repeat what you say the change is that...
The change to our culture in the 1700s as we became more tolerant?
Well, I think that it was very much an elite culture that created the atmosphere of tolerance at a time when the political community was an elite community. We weren't, in the early part of that period, democracies. What is very striking and rather admirable is the way in which these values became part of a system and were transmitted to a wider political community when our countries became democracies. I think that this happened because values were more easily transmitted at a time when people were more respectful of hierarchy than they are now. I don't think it's realistic to expect people to go back to a respect for hierarchy. But undoubtedly one of the reasons why that culture has decayed is that respect for hierarchy has diminished. I think that's inevitable, and the cure for it has got to be the creation or the recreation of a culture of tolerance on a rather different basis.
Well, it's been an absolute pleasure to spend the last 90 minutes with you. Thank you both so much for your erudite contributions, and more importantly, perhaps, rather than these two sitting, chatting away, is for you guys coming out on an evening to participate in this conversation as well, to play the important role of joining in civil society. And I think one of the reductions we've seen over the past couple of decades is less engagement in that space. Hopefully we're able to turn that ship around. So bravo to you as well for coming out. But would you join me now in thanking these two especially for their contributions? If you would like to hear more from Lord Sumption while he's here in New Zealand, you'll continue to see him across the media, and I think we've got him sitting down with almost every journalist in the country. But you'll also be able to hear from him as the keynote speaker at our conference, our AGM, come Saturday. So if you would like to receive those details, please do make sure you're signed up to our updates, and we'll make sure you get that link to see him live then as well. But thank you very much. Enjoy your evening.